This might be the strangest week on the Jewish calendar, and you wouldn't even know it. So the only thing you'll know about this week is that we don't say Tachanun. It's the only thing that feels unusual. And it's particularly unusual because we don't say Tachanun despite the fact that there is no special date. Yom Tov is behind us. So there's no special dates celebrating any particular thing that we can identify with and say, this is why we don't say Tachanun, because Tachanun is supposed to tell you that there's a certain element of joy, that there's a certain element of some unique spiritual value. And none of that seems evident this week, and yet we don't say Tachanun. But that's not the strangest part at all. The question is why we don't say Tachanun, and when you uncover that, that's when you start to realize how unusual this is. Now, before we can unpack why we don't say Tachanun this week, or at least until the 12th of Sivan, we've got to go back a little bit and just compare the holiday of Shavuos, which we've just celebrated, with the other two major pilgrimage holidays, which are Pesach and Sukkot. And as soon as we do that, immediately you can tell that there's a very obvious difference between them. What's the most obvious difference? How long they are. Pesach and Sukkot are 7-day holidays, and Shavuos is a 1-day holiday. Okay, outside of Israel, there's an added day to each Yom Tov, but fundamentally, Pesach and Sukkot are 7 days, and Shavuos is 1 day. Now, why is that relevant to anything? I mean, you could just say that's, Pesach. If you look at the story actually unfolded over 7 days. The first day was the Exodus, the 7th day was the splitting of the sea, so that kind of makes sense. Sukkot, it's not so clear what event of 7 days is commemorated. We do know that Shemini Atzeres is its own Yom Tov, so maybe you could say it's the stretch from the one to the other. But Shavuos makes sense. It's a single-day event, the giving of the Torah, so it makes sense that the holiday should be 1 day, at least at a superficial level. And perhaps as we go through this, we'll discover that maybe that's not the only reason why Shavuos is 1 day. But there's something else that is particularly relevant that we wouldn't even think of because it's not part of how we celebrate Yom Tov today. But once we look at this particular facet, A, it will explain why we don't say Tachanun during these few days, and B, it's just going to raise a whole lot of questions. So what is that? Remember, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot are the 3 pilgrimage festivals. And the Torah uses the expression that says, Shalosh pa'amim bashana, 3 times a year, Yeh ra'eh. You should be seen in the temple. So that tells us you've got to be there because in order to be seen, obviously you have to be present. So that's where we learn that you've got to go up to the Beis Hamikdash, to the temple for these 3 pilgrimage festivals. Fine, that's simple. But what do you do when you get there? Nobody really necessarily thinks about that. I mean, if it's Pesach, you celebrate Pesach. And if it's Sukkot, you celebrate Sukkot. And if it's Shavuos, you celebrate Shavuos. But what did you have to do at the temple? You could celebrate all of those festivals at home. You could eat matzah at home. Okay, so Pesach, we know that there's a Pesach sacrifice. And you had to get to the temple in order to bring the Pesach sacrifice before the Yom Tov began, because the Pesach sacrifice was brought on the 14th, and the Yom Tov actually begins that night. Fine, okay, we get that. But what did you need to be in the temple for on Sukkot, for example? And why was it necessary, for example, to stay in the Beis Hamikdash for longer after on Pesach? Sure, you could have gone, brought your Pesach sacrifice, spent the first day there, and then gone home. So what do we need the rest of the days for? In addition to the Pesach sacrifice, every time that you went up for Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, you had other sacrificial obligations as well. And they were called Oilos Re'iyah, and Oila is a burnt offering, and Re'iyah is to be seen. So because these are considered the times that you have to go be seen in the Beis Hamikdash, so the sacrifice that you had to bring was called the sacrifice of being seen, because that's your obligation. So you had to bring an oila offering. By the way, there's an AI app that you could use at the moment to calculate if you had to go to the Beis Hamikdash today, what your budget would need to be for all the sacrifices that you'd need to bring. And you'll discover that it's not a cheap exercise to go to the Beis Hamikdash. I mean, I don't know what animals cost in those days, but it was relative, obviously, to what you earned. So you had to bring the oila offering, which was already an expense, and then you had to bring something that was called the Shalmei Chagiga. Now, a shlamim is a different kind of an offering. A shlamim is a 3-way split. Part of it is burnt on the altar, part of it is eaten by the kohanim, and part of it is eaten by the person who brings the sacrifice. And that is chagiga, right? Like the word chag. This is the sacrifice of festivity. In fact, so much so that we're told, the sages in the Gemara say, Ein simcha ela bebasar. that the only way that you could experience simcha, and we know that Yom Tov is supposed to be a time of simcha, v'samachta b'chagecha, that you're supposed to rejoice on your festivals. So the Gemara says that the only way that you really rejoice is by eating the meat of the shlamim offering that you brought on Yom Tov. So now you had two sacrifices that you had to bring. In addition to when it was Pesach, then you also had to bring the Pesach sacrifice. And in addition to the fact that you might have had personal obligations through the course of the year, and you wait until Yom Tov to settle all of those personal obligations. By the time you turn around, you could be spending on a little petting zoo by the time you get to the sacrifices on Pesach, on Yom Tov. But in any event, you've got these two sacrifices. You have the Re'iyah offerings and you have the Shlamim offerings. By rights, you should bring those offerings on the first day of Yom Tov. By rights, because like any other mitzvah, if you have an opportunity to do the mitzvah, you should do it as soon as you can. But perhaps not everybody's going to manage on the first day. Perhaps there are going to be too many people on the first day. Perhaps you're going to have a lot of social responsibilities on the first day. Maybe you get delayed. I don't know. There are a whole lot of things that could happen that a person does not get to bring their sacrifice on the first day. A whole lot of possibilities. So now what? What happens if a person does not bring that oila offering or that shlamim offering that is due on Yom Tov? They don't bring it on the first day of Yom Tov. So when do you think they've got until? Makes a lot of sense. On Pesach and Sukkot, they obviously have the whole Yom Tov. So if it's a 7-day Yom Tov, then you have 7 days that you can bring the sacrifice. Just makes sense. Because these are sacrifices that are associated with the holiday. So as long as it's still the holiday, you could still bring the sacrifices. Makes a lot of sense. And we call that tashlumim. Tashlumim means to catch up or to compensate for the what you were meant to do. You were meant to bring the sacrifice and you didn't, so you get an opportunity to, so to speak, catch it up. Probably the most famous version of catching up a sacrifice is Pesach Sheni, which is a different system, but it's the same concept, surely, where if you miss the Pesach sacrifice when you were due to bring it on Pesach, so 1 month later, you get an opportunity to try again, which is the Pesach Sheni. It's the same, it would seem to be the same concept. We'll see it's not exactly the same concept, but it would seem to be the same concept, which is if you'd miss it the first time, we give you a bit of extra time to play with. So that works on Pesach, and that works on Sukkot, because they're 7-day holidays. So the Gemara asks the question, what about Shavuos? Shavuos is a 1-day holiday. Does that mean that you only have 1 day to bring all of your sacrifices? And if you miss that day, you've missed it. Nothing we can do for you, unfortunately. Is that what it means? So that's the question that the Gemara asks. And the Gemara answers that question based on a verse in the Torah, which we just read a couple of days ago when it was Shavuos. And we actually say it in the Musaf davening every Yom Tov, which is B'chag ha-matzois, u'v'chag ha-shavuos, u'v'chag ha-sukkos. That those are the 3 times Yera'eh that you have to appear before Hashem. So the Gemara says, look, the Torah associates all 3 of these holidays together. So that tells me that Shavuos behaves like the other 2. Just like Pesach and Sukkot, there is a 7-day period to bring the sacrifice. So in Shavuos, there's also a 7-day period to bring the sacrifice. Hence, from the beginning of Shavuos until 7 days later, you could have brought the sacrifice, and therefore nowadays we don't say Tachanun on those days to commemorate that this is an extension of the Yom Tov. Okay? Seems logical. So far so good. That it just seems fair, actually, that if you've got the opportunity to catch up your sacrifices on Pesach and Sukkot, just because it happens to be Yom Tov, so there's got to be a similar system for Shavuos.
Sorry to interject. So is that the reason now for no Tachanun?
That's the reason for no Tachanun. That's the reason for no Tachanun.
I even understood.
Okay, so far so good, right? There's only one little issue with this. And that is, does it make any sense that you should bring a Yom Tov sacrifice on a day that's just a regular Tuesday? In other words, the obligation of the sacrifice is to bring it on Yom Tov. If it's Pesach and you miss day 1, that's fine, because day 2, 3, 4, all the way till 7 is still Pesach. So logically, you're still in the Yom Tov, so you could still bring the sacrifice in the Yom Tov. And the same would apply to Sukkot. But it doesn't make any sense to say that once the Yom Tov is over, like in the case of Shavuos, that you could still bring the sacrifice. That would be similar. I'm just using an example. It's not necessarily similar, but I'm just using it to illustrate the point. Imagine a person doesn't get to shake the lulav and esrog on Sukkot, and they feel really bad about it. So they decide they're going to shake the lulav the day after Sukkot. Does it have any value? If a person, God forbid, misses the shofar on Rosh Hashanah because they're, let's say, God forbid, in a hospital, does it make sense, or is there any value besides the sentiment? Is there any halachic value to hearing the shofar after Rosh Hashanah? Is there any value if it's Shabbos and you forgot to make Kiddush? So is there any value to make Kiddush on Sunday? In other words, generally speaking, everything has its time frame. And whatever the relevant customs and rituals are around that particular event surely should happen in that time frame. So it's all very nice to say that there's a verse in the Torah that says V'chagat Matzos, V'chagat Shavuos, V'chagat Sukkos, that they're all linked to each other. But practically, how does this even work? How does it make any sense that you should bring a Pesach offering on a day, a Shavuos offering on a day that's not Shavuos? It's not Yom Tov at all. It's very much an ordinary day. Okay, so that's our question that we're going to try and unpack. How did this even happen? Okay. Now, there are many, many technical issues that you could debate around this. We're not going to get into all of those technical issues, as interesting as they are, because it's just going to get really complex. But the simple question we're asking is, how do you bring a Yom Tov offering on a day that is not Yom Tov? By the way, just to make it a little bit more radical, there's a debate, another debate, in the Gemara between the yeshiva of Shammai and the yeshiva of Hillel, what we call Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And here's where things get even more intriguing. See, you can cook on Yom Tov, right? Correct? You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov?
Yeah.
As opposed to Shabbos. Right. So, under what circumstances are you allowed to cook on Yom Tov? Only if it's something that you're going to eat. So, for example, you're not permitted to cook something on Yom Tov that you'll only eat after Yom Tov. Or, for example, you wouldn't be permitted just to cook something for fun. You have to actually benefit from it in order to be allowed to cook it on Yom Tov. Now, we identified that there are two offerings that you have to bring on Yom Tov. One is called an oila is re'iyah, and one is called a shlomim, shalmei chagiga. A shlomim is a three-way split. You get to eat some of it. So can you bring it on Yom Tov? Yes. Yeah. An oila is fully burnt on the altar. So can you bring it on Yom Tov? Depends who you ask. According to Beis Shammai, because it's something that you cannot actually personally enjoy on Yom Tov, you actually shouldn't bring it on Yom Tov. So Beis Shammai rules, are you ready for this? Because it's going to be the weirdest law. Beis Shammai rules that even though this is a sacrifice that you are meant to bring on Yom Tov, because you're not really supposed to cook on Yom Tov unless you're going to eat from it, you should bring the oila offering the day after Shavuos. So in other words, Beis Shammai is of the view, forget about the catch-up that if you missed it on the first day, you've got a whole week of regular weekdays that you could bring a Yom Tov sacrifice. Beis Shammai goes even more radical than that and says, you know what? In the first instance, the oila Yom Tov offering should be brought after Yom Tov, which seems like a very bizarre perspective. But what makes it even more bizarre is that most of the community followed Beis Shammai's opinion, including the people of Beis Hillel, who held that you can bring that sacrifice on Yom Tov on Shavuos. In practice, they brought the sacrifice the day after Yom Tov. So Shavuos, and that's only on Shavuos. It doesn't apply on Pesach, it doesn't apply on Sukkot. So there's something very strange happening on Shavuos, where you're bringing a Yom Tov offering when it's no longer Yom Tov. Either because it's your catch-up time frame, or because in the first instance, that's actually how you bring the sacrifice, when it's a weekday. And that seems incredibly strange. Why would you have a Yom Tov sacrifice that is brought on an ordinary weekday and is still called a Yom Tov sacrifice? Just nothing about it seems to make sense. Okay? Now, to try and understand this, like is often the case in Judaism, they say, before you can answer a question, you've got to ask another question. People usually say you answer a question with a question. But in Jewish thinking, before you can answer a question, you have to ask another question. So here's one more question that should get you to be really curious. And this is an interesting test that we could do just to get to this question. If I had to ask you, what is the unique mitzvah or mitzvahs of Pesach? What would you say?
Matzah.
You have to eat matzah.
4 cups of wine.
That's not a mitzvah. 4 cups of wine. I'm saying when I say
hummus, but that's
correct, not eating chametz. When I say a mitzvah, I mean something that's mandated by the Torah, right? So it's eating matzah, not eating chametz, and one more, telling the story of the Exodus. Fine, clear, right? Okay, and that works because every mitzvah that is unique to a holiday is supposed to capture what the theme and the essence of that holiday is. So the theme and the essence of the holiday of Pesach is the Exodus from Egypt. So the unique mitzvahs of Pesach are obviously linked to the Exodus from Egypt, which makes sense. No chometz, eat matzah, tell the story. Great. What are the unique mitzvahs of Sukkot?
lulav.
Lulav and esrog, and to eat in a sukkah. And they capture the main theme of Sukkot. Because the main theme of Sukkot is that Hashem protected us when we were in the desert. So we build a sukkah that is supposed to protect us. And even, according to one opinion, the reason we shake the lulav and esrog in all the different directions is to dispel any kind of negative energy, which is the same theme of protection. So you capture the theme of the holiday in the unique mitzvah of that holiday. Okay? What about Rosh Hashanah? What's the unique mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah?
Shofar.
It's to blow the shofar. So that captures the unique theme of Rosh Hashanah, which is to accept Hashem or to coronate Hashem as our king. And the sound of the shofar is supposed to represent the trumpet blasts that herald the new king. So it captures the theme and the essence of the holiday. What's the unique mitzvah of Shavuos?
I told you last time when you said it was wrong.
Okay?
Cheeseburger.
So as we know, all of the things that we do on Shavuos are custom. Staying up the whole night to learn, listening to the Ten Commandments, and eating dairy products, the Megillah of Ruth, whatever you want to say, these are all traditions. There's no mitzvah that the Torah mandates that you have to do on Shavuos. Now, that's a little strange, right? Because
it's linked. And
it's linked to?
you just said in Musaf.
Of course.
Sukkot,
They're all three of them are linked, absolutely.
But all of them have got a mitzvah except
Shavuos. So now it doesn't seem like it's such a link.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Right?
It's
Not only does it missing link, exactly. Not only does it not seem like there's a clear link between all the three holidays now, but it actually seems that the theme, because remember, the mitzvah is supposed to capture the theme of what that Yom Tov is. So now it seems like the theme of Pesach is clear. The theme of Sukkot is clear. The theme of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, they're all clear themes. And the theme of Shavuos does not seem to be clear. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, the theme of Shavuos is that that's the day of the giving of the Torah, which is the historical event. But then the mitzvah should have been something associated with that. So the mitzvah, for example, should have been that you have to learn a certain portion of the Torah, or you have to learn a certain amount of hours of Torah, or something like that would capture the essence of what this holiday is. And yet we find that not only is there not a mitzvah associated specifically with Torah. Again, staying up to learn Torah through the night is a custom. And listening to the Ten Commandments, even though there's a mitzvah to read the Torah on a Yom Tov, but the fact that that is the Torah reading that we read, it's not mandated by the Torah. So it's
the lead up via the Omer.
The counting of the Omer is its own mitzvah. It's a good point. So the counting of the Omer is its own mitzvah in its own time period that ends before Shavuos starts. On Shavuos itself, we don't even have a celebration of the completion of the counting of the Omer, right? Which even that would have made sense because it's the process that is mandated by the Torah. So there's something very strange about Shavuos, which we're starting to see. And that is that Shavuos doesn't seem to be very specifically defined. Because look, in time, it's a very small amount of time. You cannot get a shorter holiday than 1 day. That's obviously the minimum, right? You're not going to have a half a day holiday. So it's the shortest version of a holiday, which means that time-wise, it's not particularly defined, doesn't step into your week. In fact, if you want to look at it from another perspective, you could say that the other two major festivals, they incorporate the whole week into the experience, and Shavuos doesn't. It doesn't have a unique mitzvah associated with it, so that leaves us with a sense that the theme of Shavuos is somehow just a little bit blurry or undefined. And part of the way that you celebrate Shavuos, which is to bring the sacrifices, extends into a time that's not even Shavuos anymore, which basically means, let's say today I didn't get to bring my sacrifices on Shavuos and I bring it today. Nobody else is even going to feel the connection between me bringing the sacrifices and Shavuos, because unless you know exactly which animal I'm bringing and why I'm bringing it, you wouldn't even know that it's a Shavuos sacrifice, because there's nothing about the time that illustrates that this is associated with Yom Tov. So isn't it odd that the holiday which really sits at the core of all the other holidays, because it's the time of the giving of the Torah, or for that matter sits at the core of the whole Jewish experience, because it's the time of the giving of the Torah, should be a holiday that seems to be, in a sense, weaker than the other holidays. Weaker because it doesn't have any specific mitzvah. Weaker because when you bring the sacrifices, it's not even a holiday anymore. So that really doesn't seem to make sense. You would expect that Shavuos would be the most defined, the most clear, the most obvious version of all of the holidays. So that's going to be our question that we have to try and unpack. How is it that Shavuos is able to extend into regular weekdays without retaining its identity? And how is it that it doesn't really seem to have a very strong identity in the first place, because it doesn't have a specific mitzvah or set of mitzvahs associated with it? Okay, that's what we have to try and work out.